Welcome to another video here on The Pulse. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to talk a little bit today about a new investigation or special report that was published by Politico. It's called How Bill Gates and Partners Used Their Clout to Control the Global COVID Response with Little Oversight. So obviously this is a story so many people have been raising awareness about for quite some time. And now we have an 8-month investigation that has gone into this particular story that involves the, interviewing of, I believe it was something like 4 dozen high-ranking politicians in Europe, in the United States, in North America in general. And they're basically anonymously able to tell very candidly to Politico and Welt, who basically came together to do this investigation, what exactly was going on behind the scenes. And this is a story that has been pretty well blacked out in the media. Nobody has covered this. I want to read this summarizing line from Politico. 4 health organizations working closely together spent almost $10 billion on responding to COVID across the world, but they lacked the scrutiny of governments and fell short of their own goals, a Politico and Welt investigation found. So whether or not, you agree with the line of lacking scrutiny from governments as if, that's a given that would happen. I want to dive into what some of the key takeaways from this investigation are, because although this is coming from what, we might call mainstream media, there is a lot of powerful takeaways from within this piece. And there's actually some interesting reasons as to why this investigation likely happened here from Politico now versus before, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. But here are the key takeaways. The 4 organizations have spent almost $10 billion on COVID since 2020, the same amount as the leading U.S. agency tasked with fighting COVID abroad. The organizations collectively gave $1.4 billion to World Health Organization, where they helped create a critical initiative to distribute COVID-19 tools. That program failed to achieve its original benchmarks. The organization's leaders had unprecedented access to the highest levels of government, spending at least $8.3 million to lobby lawmakers and officials in the US and Europe. Officials from the US, EU, and representatives from the WHO rotated through these 4 organizations as employees, helping them solidify their political and financial connections in Washington and Brussels. The leaders of the 4 organizations pledged to bridge the equity gap. However, during the worst waves of the pandemic, low-income countries were left without life-saving vaccines. Leaders of 3 of the 4 organizations maintained that lifting intellectual property protections was not needed to increase vaccine supplies, which activists believe would have helped save lives. So we're joined now here by Richard Garner. He's a media expert and host of a Third Way podcast. Richard, what are some of your, initial reactions? I know you've been looking into this piece quite extensively. What are some of your key takeaways here off the top?
Well, I mean, the ones that were listed were, certainly the most salient points. Quick summary being that, and it's not breaking news because, again, people like yourself, many people have been asking this question for a long time. Why does this foundation dictate government policy? Why is Bill Gates giving State of the Union type addresses throughout a pandemic? Why is he doing a media tour essentially demanding and dictating what the CDC and the WHO do during a pandemic? How did they get such disproportionate power, and why are we allowing it to happen? So, they cover the lobbying, they cover things we've talked about here before, the ridiculous amounts of money they give to different journalistic institutions throughout the world. And again, this wasn't all just in the last 3 years. This has been a plan, a pattern that's been going on since really the foundation was established.
Yeah.
For them to be coming out with a 7-month investigation, where they interviewed not just anyone, they interviewed top US and European government officials. They interviewed people from Doctors Without Borders, from various universities. Again, getting to the conclusion that there's really 4 organizations that ran the pandemic response in the world and dictated to governments what their response should be. And all 4 of those organizations are Bill Gates founded or funded organizations, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Not breaking news. But to the level to which they were able to dictate that they would take care of getting tests to developing countries, get vaccines to the people that needed it most in developing countries, and set targets and get money to do these things, and then fall miserably short of those targets, which were
Mhm.
always unrealistic to begin with, and then also claim throughout this process when they through Act A, which was a thing that was created during the pandemic, um, to claim that releasing or sharing the patents for the vaccines with the developing countries would somehow not necessarily, uh, end up being something that would be beneficial is obviously a level of preposterousness that we've probably not come across in our lives. Yet, as we sit here today, the same man that went through, I don't know, a Me Too level disaster that would have ended anyone and did end many people with way less egregious acts. Bill Gates goes through a fully documented relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and yet this guy is sitting down with Savannah Guthrie in about 5 months ago on the Today Show, talking about his new book, whatever, how to prevent the next pandemic. So not only has he been
Yeah.
given this pedestal to direct the entire, forget about the pandemic response, really the World Health Organization and World Health period, but he has somehow managed to escape permanent condemnation for really egregious acts with Epstein, etc., and then also be able to now this week, Joe, he is going to be at the UN General Assembly speaking about everything from world hunger to pandemic response and sharing the results of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's um, goalkeepers report that they put out that basically holds the UN's feet to the fire on getting to their 2030 sustainability goals, meaning that post pandemic, you're going to hear more from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation / Bill Gates on what we should be doing and government should be doing about climate change. It's really unbelievable. And you'd think, well, wow, this political report comes out. It really cites in an incredibly objective and credible way all the ways that this is anti democratic, that this is circumventing government, um, and yet zero response from any other media. Nobody else picked it up, Joe.
Yeah, yeah,
Nobody, and I
yeah.
don't mean sort of like a few people, and I'm exaggerating. I mean, you did a Google search. Did you find anybody else that even commented on this story?
No, and this is what's interesting here, right? Because I mean, at least from what I found, I mean, it's been 5 days. We're recording this 5 days since this piece came out in Politico. You know, I haven't seen anybody else in U.S. media say, or even Canadian media, talk about it when we're talking about from a mainstream perspective. I can't even find things from like The Guardian or other sort of European outlets that are fairly well known, like let's say the Telegraph. So nobody's covering this for some reason, and I'm not sure why. It makes me ask this question because obviously this idea around why does Bill Gates have so much power during the pandemic? Why is it that there's such a lack of transparency about how he's ultimately getting funds from governments? So many things that are happening that governments are just agreeing to are happening through him, and people are going, why does he have so much power? And this was kind of shut down as, oh, come on, that's conspiracy. And now we have an investigation. Why, in your opinion, did the media always protect this guy um, up until this moment? What changed?
Again, this is not a small piece of this, which is that Politico was bought by an organization out of Germany. I can't remember what they're called, but anyways, they were bought by a massive publication organization in Germany last year. It's been less than a year that they've owned them. They essentially bought it and started this organization or this investigation. So obviously, this was something that they wanted to shed light on, and more than likely wouldn't have happened if that change of ownership didn't happen. So why were they not affected by this behind closed doors influence peddling? We're not sure at this point. And again, we could speculate all day as to what the final agenda is of a Bill Gates and all the stuff with GMOs and farmland and all of these things. They certainly point to somebody with an idea and a plan. And you could say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's nefarious. I agree. It doesn't. But it certainly means that this person has decided that he knows best. They know best what is in the best interest of the world and of the people in the world, and they're going to drive that direction and dictate government policy at every level. And NGOs, including the UN, like we were talking about before, are now going to be pressured into doing things that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation / Bill Gates wants them to do. And you even have outspoken people like Doctors Without Borders, for instance. I'll read, this is another quote from the article. Civil society organizations active in poorer nations, including Doctors Without Borders, those conspiracy theorists, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, express discomfort with the notion that Western-dominated groups, staffed by elite teams of experts, would be helping guide life and death decisions affecting people in poorer nations. Those tensions only increased when the Gates Foundation opposed efforts to waive intellectual property rights, a move that critics saw as protecting the interests of pharmaceutical giants over people living in poor nations. Here's the quote. What makes Bill Gates qualified to be giving advice and advising the U.S. government on where they should be putting the tremendous resources of the foundation? Asked Kate Elder, senior vaccine policy advisor to Doctors Without Borders. I would just say at this point, it would be irrational and immature, even would be the word I would use, to suggest that there isn't a conspiracy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you ask the question of conspiracy, and if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, the definition here is a secret plan by a group to do something unlawful or harmful. There's another piece here, the action of plotting or conspiring. So some people are going to argue, well, was it harmful? And you go over to the Politico piece. And you ask the question. I mean, they've already sort of failed in a lot of what they've done. A lot of the the poorer nations didn't end up getting any of the support that they required and that they were promised, so to speak. There's a couple quotations here. This one from Lawrence Gostin, a Georgetown University professor who specializes in public health law. I think we should be deeply concerned. Putting in a very crass way, money buys influence, and this is the worst kind of influence. Not just because it's money, although that's important, but because money shouldn't dictate policy, but also because it's preferential access behind closed doors. And then he goes on to say, it's anti-democratic because it's extraordinarily non-transparent and opaque, and it leaves behind ordinary people, communities, and civil society. So in all of those things and all of those realizations, which again, like you've pointed out, comes from an 8-month-long investigation, you're seeing the harm. Right? You're seeing the lack of transparency. So absolutely, this is conspiring behind closed doors. But the one thing that's interesting here is, and you mentioned it just a second ago, is this idea of, money buying the influence, right? And they even say in the article, the WHO was crucial. The World Health Organization was crucial to the rise of power of these groups. All of them had long-standing ties to the global health body, and much of the group's clout with the WHO stems simply from money. So what we're seeing here in a story, and I'd love to get your take on this, is at the end of the day, is this not just, money is controlling and buying influence? Our systems are able to be controlled by powerful people, and at the end of the day, people are always left behind?
Well, I mean, and that's what can be proven, right? The receipts are there. If again, media or other investigators are willing to do the work, as some great journalists have already, including this article in Politico, and with it was a collaboration with German publication Welt, WELT. And again, we ask these questions throughout. A lot of people ask these questions. Why does a former software programming guy, who's admittedly, yes, he consults experts, he deals with people, they hire smart people, but in the end, how does this guy ultimately even have the audacity, let alone the permission space by mainstream media, to be given the mantle of full credibility and really autocratic direction during a pandemic, which again, he's not qualified. Not only is he not qualified to be the driving force of something like that, but he's also demonstrated throughout his life as a leader that he's a liability when it comes to listening to other people, when it comes to collaborative decision making. He is a dictator. This was the entire history of him at Microsoft. And everybody knows that. Everybody talked about that. And before the people from Men in Black showed up and erased everybody's memories, this is all they talked about when you talked about Bill Gates. So
Yeah.
what you're telling me, this guy has had some coming to Jesus moment, and he's an entirely different person because now they have a foundation that supposedly gives away all of their money, but doesn't give away all of their money. They put all of the money into the foundation and they direct where it goes and use that to influence major NGOs and organizations. And on top of that, make money by
Yeah.
investing in vaccine technology and other things.
Yeah.
It's a complete lunacy and absolute lie that he has given away billions of dollars. It just isn't true.
Yeah. And I think this is a moment at the end of the day where, people really have to ask the question. I know you've probably been harping on this a long time. I've been harping on this a long time. If we don't start recognizing that, our systems, our infrastructures are driven by and incentivized by money, market economics, people with power, this idea that we have a democracy where you vote somebody into a position of power and that somehow gives us a say over anything. This is not really how our society is functioning. It's sort of a story that we're believing in, but time and time again, we're recognizing what is really behind the scenes, how business, how elite individuals in the world. When I say elite, I mean financially, very wealthy people are basically controlling what government does, and your vote, unfortunately, doesn't matter all that much. And given that we as people don't have, any democratic power over singular issues, only who we put in a position of power, it makes the vote almost meaningless in our society. And I think, and I hope that this is, kind of another opportunity for us to identify what the core issue is. Because, and Richard, you probably agree with this, there's a lot of people in the world right now who might be saying, well, if it wasn't for Trump, or if it wasn't for Joe Biden, or if it wasn't for Justin Trudeau, or if it wasn't for Boris Johnson, or whoever you want to pick on in the world, none of this stuff would happen. It would have been okay. But it's not the politicians. It's the system itself. The system itself is pushing this ability for things to happen that have nothing to do with the good of the people. Would you agree?
Well, this is the core of the issue, right? You read off the definitions of conspiracy earlier. So anytime I find myself in these types of discussions, and again, the problem with dualism, right? Which is, again, what we try to talk about a lot at A Third Way, which is if you make dualistic statements, then they're generally wrong because they've included generalizations, they've included a bunch of things, and really there's a spectrum of everything, 1 to 100, let's say. So if you're not comfortable, and if you've somehow convinced yourself that conspiracy, the definition of conspiracy is QAnon, or lizard people, or whatever it is, and if that's allowed you to smugly convince yourself that you can laugh at the idea, well, you're an idiot. You're a 10-year-old child, because you ask anybody that tries to go down that road and hide behind that gutless, conspiracy, and then you just say, do you know what the definition is? Well, it's whatever. No, it isn't. It is simply people in powerful positions conspiring. Well, what is the history of the world, Joe? It is government and rich people conspiring to maintain power. Nobody on the left would deny that. That is what really gave rise to liberalism, was to speak truth to that power. This idea that we go and pull a lever every 4 years and it has some dramatic effect on the direction of society is childish, man.
So a lot to discuss here, and I kind of want to drive home the point that this pandemic response, if you will, could have gone completely differently. Now let's pretend, let's take it at face value. You know, we had a moment where there was a health crisis and people were dying, and you know, let's just take that story, right? If we were actually trying to, as governments, as organizations, as countries, that we're all on the same team, we're in this together, right? Let's imagine this story, because I mean, ultimately, this is the story that is passed out, that most people believe in. It's the worldview that drives our world, which is that governments are here to care for us. They're looking out for our health. They're looking out for our well-being. That's what the World Health Organization does. So let's pretend that that is the story. What would have happened? What would this have looked like if market economics and profit was not the motive? What likely would have happened is you would have had a team come together, say, hey, is there any existing treatments that could have worked? And then people would have looked around and said, hey, you know, let's see, is there existing treatments? Oh yeah, you know, there is. Okay, great. Let's use them. Let's take all those treatments. Let's have a whole bunch of people develop these treatments. Let's, you know, have governments pay these companies basically costs, maybe plus a tiny percentage for a little bit of profit. And they would distribute those treatments throughout, because all we want is everybody to be better. And if there was no treatments, we'd say, okay, fine, let's develop a vaccine. So they decide to develop a vaccine, and they might task a whole bunch of companies, say, hey, try out different things. Let's do some studies. Let's really try and find out which one's working. Let's say you manage to hone in on that and you somehow have a great safety profile and you manage to hone in on that. You would say, okay, great. Let's release the patent to everybody. Again, we're going to pay every single vaccine manufacturer, who are all, creating the same recipe because we found the best one. It was a group effort to find the best thing, not for everybody to compete with each other. Then they would have said, okay, let's all make the same vaccines. Let's, again, pay everybody costs so they're not losing money, plus a little tiny percentage for some profits so they're not profiting during this vaccine manufacturing time. And, you know, that's how it would function if you kept our systems exactly the way it is, with market economics and profit running our countries, right? Running the way our system functions. If we really cared, profit would not have been the largest motive here. Now, that did not happen. Instead, what happened is patents were privatized, all these companies competed with each other, the people at the end of the day footed the bill, and these companies made billions and billions of dollars, all while, as per usual, you know, people in developing countries lost out on being able to have access to what wealthier countries have. So we can see, just by the way we responded to this pandemic, by the way the world and the World Health Organization responded to this pandemic, that it's not about public health. It's not about doing this for each other. It's not about a community of people coming together to take care of one another. This is the story we're told, but this is not what is happening in reality. Now, of course, I would propose the idea that we don't need to have any of these markets or these profit engines running our entire world. In fact, it's these profit engine, sort of ways in which our system operates that is actually creating the vast majority of the problems that we have. And we continue to do this because we continue to believe that this is the only way for humanity to live. But that's for another discussion. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I just want us to realize that when we have and hold the belief that Bill Gates or our governments or the World Health Organization is just trying to do their best, I hope we realize through this story that this is not what is happening. And the quicker we wake up from the delusion that this is what's going on, the quicker we can change our story, the quicker we can change our worldview, and the quicker we can come together and start creating new systems that allow our world to truly thrive, because that is not what's happening in the way our world is truly functioning today. That's it. That's all. Hope you enjoyed this video. I encourage you to go read the Politico piece. It is pretty fascinating. As always, subscribe, pass this on to somebody else. That's it. That's all.